Okay. All right. Continuing on now through our trip through Genesis. We're in Genesis 37 now. And I've mentioned an awful lot that many times God will not reveal his whole plan for us, for our lives, simply because he does not want us to try to commandeer the plan or take any shortcuts. He moves us along, kind of like what we said, in a series of short steps, letting us know what is the next task once we have completed the current one to his satisfaction. It's like, maps or Google Maps or whatever, which only shows you, okay, go this far, then turn right, then you'll find out what's next. It's the same way. And this is not just because he doesn't want us to commandeer the plan, but he also wants to prepare us for whatever the next step may be. And I don't care how old we are, we should always be continuing to grow in the Lord and seeking his will, even if it seems like we have made it. Because if we think we have made it, chances are we have not. Now, when I was a teacher, there was a buzzword that I heard all the time, and frankly, it was one of the few I actually agreed with. Okay, most of the buzzwords, seamless transition or whatever, they're just renaming of something that had before, like, cooperative learning. Yeah, we used to call that cheating. But, things along those lines. But this one, I actually agreed with. It was LLL, which meant lifelong learners. And it was one of our goals as a teacher back at that time, when it was really big, was not just to teach the students the material, but to teach them to be lifelong learners, that education just didn't stop. Now, granted, some interpreted this to mean, you're going to college. But the actual meaning is much deeper than that. From the moment we are born, we start learning. Period. We're trying to make sense of the world we've suddenly found ourselves in. When my oldest boy was born, obviously you're in a nice warm place in the womb, and now you're out in this cold world, and he's crying his discontent at this change. And I remember just when he was lying there, I got to carry him over to the examination table. And when they were through looking at him, they had a little heater up there, but he was still crying. But there was a silver thing. Honestly, I have no clue what it was. Just a little silver thing. It almost looked like a weight or a mass for a balance or something. But it was very bright, very shiny. And he'd be crying, and it was just beyond his field of vision where he could focus on it. Babies, they're very short-sighted. And he would cry, and then suddenly he'd stop crying. You could tell he's trying to zero in on that thing. What is it? He's learning. He's trying to make sense of it all. And then, being a baby, he'd lose interest, start crying again, and then suddenly, boom. Ooh, there's that thing again. What is it? What's it doing there? And it was kind of neat to watch that you see how the learning starts at the very beginning. However, some people think, no, that's not really learning. Well, no, it is. I mean, you don't have to sit a textbook in front of a baby and expect him to learn calculus. That's not lifelong learning. There's no reason to do this. It comes naturally with life, and it never ends. Okay? We never stop learning. We should never stop learning. Solomon said, there is nothing new under the sun. That's true, but new things do crop up in our own experiences, and we need to learn from them. Always. Always. Solomon wrote in Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. That tells us, you have to keep learning. Now, everyone can learn. I don't care how old you are. Sometimes there are people who are a little more dense than others. And we're going to kind of see this at the beginning of this next section of the book of Genesis, which, the focus zeroes in now on Jacob's second youngest son, Joseph. So if you have your Bibles with you, go ahead and open it up to Genesis chapter 37. We're starting in verse 1. Now recall that Joseph was the firstborn of Jacob's second wife, but his favorite wife, Rachel. And thus, as he grew, Joseph became the favorite. Okay? All the other sons from all his other wife, Leah, and his two concubines were treated more as servants than sons. And of course, they all felt this, and they did a lot to spite their father. And these actions merely added flames to a smoldering fire that was about to burst and explode, and it's going to burn everybody around him when this happens. And it's interesting that despite his age, Jacob never learned that the family drama around him was of his own design. He was making the same mistakes his own father had, and he seemed oblivious to it. Talk about dense. But as we're going to see, God is still going to use even these horrible events we're going to look at to move his plan along and to prepare his chosen people for their future. In particular, one rather big-mouthed teenager. Okay, so let's begin as this drama tragically unfolds. Genesis chapter 37, starting in verse 1. Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. This is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers, and the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. Also he made him a tunic of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Let's stop there. So Jacob's back in the promised land, but he's still dwelling there like a stranger, just like his father and his grandfather before him. Now, if we had turned back, you don't have to. We go back to Genesis chapter 25. Jacob's father, Isaac, dwelt in a place called Beer Lahai Roi, which is now known as Hebron or Hebron. And so far as we know, this is where Jacob was living at this time. This is where he settled down. And as we saw 2 weeks ago, Isaac's still alive. Even though he's not mentioned here, he's still alive. So probably Jacob was taking care of Isaac as he was the expected heir of the family. He had the birthright. It was his responsibility as the quote-unquote firstborn to take care of dad in these situations. Now the statement we see here, it says the history of Jacob. And I like the way the New International Version is, these are the generations of Jacob. This tells us that we are moving into a new section in Genesis. And we mentioned this last time in Genesis. If you missed it, with chapter 36 had all the generations, through Esau and so forth. So what we're going to see now is a focus on not so much Jacob, but his family. We really got to know Jacob pretty well starting in chapter 25. So now we move on to the sons. Okay? Now Jacob's not going to disappear. Isaac seemed to disappear for a while. Jacob still plays a part, but now we focus on particularly Joseph. Joseph is mentioned twice as many times as Jacob is in the next 14 chapters of Genesis. That's our focus. And Jacob does stay in the picture, but it's Joseph who will occupy center stage for the most part. As I mentioned, Isaac is still alive, but he plays no further role in the events that followed, and that's why he's never mentioned. And I mentioned we don't know, but I'm thinking because he's old, he may actually be in no shape to actually do anything. He may actually even be senile. We don't know. We know he's blind, but he's still alive. Now, the seeds of destruction that had been sown years before were now starting to come to fruition because Jacob's sons were now falling out with each other. Now, the sons of Leah and the concubine wives, they were not loved by Jacob. We've mentioned this many, many times. And that's because he really never loved their mothers. He had eyes only for Rachel. And now, because Rachel was dead, that affection is now being applied to Joseph and his younger brother Benjamin. Now, already in chapters 34 and 35, we saw there's a lot of tension between all the other brothers and Jacob. And now we are going to see the tension comes to the point where the family is now about to snap. Now, the sons of Bilhah mentioned here, they were Dan and Naphtali, and the sons of Zilpah were Gad and Asher. And Joseph was apparently their assistant, more likely their apprentice, kind of learning the ropes of how to take care of the sheep. Now at 17, even though Joseph is younger than the rest of his brothers, he's not that much younger. All the rest are well into their 20s, so even the youngest was probably a couple of years, maybe 3 or 4 years difference. Not really what I would consider like, well, a lot of Bible stories. You know, all the brothers were adults, but Joseph's down here still a kid. He's not. He's considered a kid by the law at that point, but no, he's not. He's not a baby anymore. And they probably viewed him a little bit. Oh yeah, you're just a youngster. You're the baby of the family, when in fact Benjamin was. But they really didn't like him because of the favoritism. It's really clear. And there's another problem. And at least Joseph's brothers viewed this as a problem. And that problem that really got them on him, Joseph was a young man of integrity. This hints that his upbringing was quite different compared to the rest, suggesting that Joseph, and I would say likely Benjamin, were instructed directly by Jacob in the ways of the Lord. So you learn. You don't lie. You don't steal. You don't cheat. You don't do any of these things. You stay away from the idols. You stay away from the false gods. And that clearly was in Joseph's heart. As we continue on through his saga, we see a man of integrity who stays that way. He doesn't compromise any way, whereas we don't see that with the other brothers. Okay? And of course, if Jacob loved Joseph more than the others, that would be why he would instruct him directly, because he views him as his heir. And you're thinking, well, why? He's got a bunch of older brothers, 10 older brothers, who were born way before he was. Well, here's the problem. And this is speculation, but a lot of scholars might think that, well, he never intended to marry Leah or the other two. Okay? He had wanted Rachel. That's who he worked for. And so in his mind, he could have thought, well, yeah, I ended up marrying Leah and the other two as concubines. But no, Rachel's my wife, and therefore Joseph is my heir because he's my actual firstborn. And this integrity, and he brought him up to be, very truthful. And so what happens is that he's out with the brothers, and as it says here, he brings a bad report to his father. Now, I imagine it wasn't easy for Joseph to work alongside his half-brothers because his way of life was so different from their way of life. Okay? While he had integrity, apparently the brothers did not. And we get the hint here that they're involved in something that would be probably displeasing to his father and was likely displeasing to God. We don't know what it is. The Bible doesn't tell us. Maybe they were robbing from their father. Maybe they were getting too involved with the ways of the people of Canaan. We don't know what they're up to. But whatever it was, Joseph felt that their father needed to know about it, so he reported their activities to Jacob. Now this brings up a question. Was Joseph right in snitching on his brothers? Well, I will honestly say throughout my own Bible education, this is years in private school and Christian schools, and even in Sunday school, I was always taught that Joseph should be always held high in esteem for his character. He's an honest guy. He never did anything wrong. But as I got to study more as an adult and looking through it, in this particular instance, he could also be considered a teenage tattletale. I'm Dad's favorite, so I'm going to tell on you because you shouldn't be doing that. And here's why. He didn't have any authority over his brothers. Okay? He was the youngest. He was the apprentice, not the master. He wasn't their foreman. He wasn't their supervisor. And he certainly wasn't accountable for their behavior. The whole point of him being in the fields was to work with them, not to spy on them. And whatever his brothers were doing, it must have been pretty bad. Or Joseph probably would never have mentioned it to his father. Maybe Jacob himself, and I think this is might be a possibility too. Jacob suspected that his sons were up to no good, And he asked Joseph when he got home, okay, what did they do? What were they doing? And being a man of integrity, he wasn't going to lie to his father. And so when Jacob confronted his other sons with what they were doing, I'm sorry, it wasn't going to take Sherlock Holmes to figure out who the informer was. It was real easy, okay? And their anger, he's a snitch, he's a tattletale. It merely was fed by this overt favoritism. And Jacob, again, we said this before, Jacob didn't learn anything from his own past. He experienced the sad consequences of favoritism on the part of his own father Isaac and during his years with Laban. He should have known better than to single out Joseph and clearly pamper him. But again, hey, he's Rachel's son, can do no wrong. And a lot of times the human heart plays tricks with the mind and makes people do some pretty strange things. And that's where the origin of this coat comes from, the amazing Technicolor dream coat, as some call it. Now, we don't really know a lot about what this thing is. It's the coat of many colors. And the Hebrew word is used in a couple other places, and it's referring to a garment of a king's daughter. Okay, so it's a richly ornamented robe. It looks really nice. Probably reached down to his ankles, probably had long sleeves. It was a formal garment. This is not something you were going to go out in the fields as a shepherd wearing under normal conditions. Anymore would you dress up in a three-piece suit to change the oil on your car. That's the type of garment we are talking about. But this is extremely important because Jacob had more in mind than just fashion when he gave this coat to Joseph. It may have been, and I think it probably was, his way of letting the family know that Joseph had been chosen to be his heir. Okay? Now, recall, the oldest brother, Reuben, he had forfeited his firstborn status because of his sin with Bilhah. And then Simeon, number 2, had been involved with Levi, number 3, in slaughtering the men of Shechem. And again, Jacob's first 4 sons had Leah as their mother. And that logic that says, hey, I never intended to marry her, so they don't exist. And he's thinking, no, Joseph has the right to be treated as the firstborn because I really don't recognize these as my sons. Really, really poor logic. And if the brothers viewed this scenario in the exact same way, then it's no surprise that they hated Joseph. Okay? You're wearing the robe of a master, and you're the youngest. You think you're going to tell us what? You don't even know how to herd sheep. We have to be with us to teach you how to do that. Hatred. It's a terrible sin because it generates other sins. Now, Jesus told us in the Sermon on the Mount that hatred in the heart is the moral equivalent of murder. And the Apostle John writes in 1 John 3:15, anyone who hates his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life in him. Pretty clear. You hate somebody, it's equivalent to murder. And whatever justification Joseph had for telling on his brothers, I think the next incident truly shows his immaturity, or frankly, that the robe had gone to his head. So let's continue on. Verse 5. Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So he said to them, please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. And behold, my sheep arose and also stood upright. And indeed, your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, shall you indeed reign over us, or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams. Then he dreamed still another dream, and told it to his brothers, and said, look, I have dreamed another dream. This time the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed down to me. So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you? And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now, I have to wonder, you really think about it, what on earth was Joseph thinking? I mean, he was very much aware of the brothers' hostility toward him. They made no attempt to hide it. And it was very likely that Jacob was aware of it too. I mean, it was a family. Everyone kind of knew the dynamic. And really, for Jacob, all he did about it was make things worse by clarifying Joseph's position as his favorite. Okay? Yeah, your brothers hate you, so here, let me give you a coat. A really wonderful coat. So they'll hate you even more. Hey, Dad, good thoughts. Okay? Now here's the question. Should Joseph have told his dreams to the family, or was just this more evidence of him being a pampered brat? Now, the two dreams couldn't help irritate the family. I mean, the first one, now, we don't know much about sheaves anymore because of the way we do harvesting, but back then, when you harvested wheat or other grain, you put them in bundles, you tied them together, and you laid them on their sides, okay? And you just stacked them out in the field, and then you gathered them later. So when he says his sheaf stood up, that's a miracle in and of itself. They are not that sturdy, but it stands up, it gets bigger, and then all the rest stand up and bow toward it. So you see the meaning of this dream is very clear, and it's something that they would look at. It's like, this is impossible. That can't happen. And to be honest, if you look at the second dream as well, how could Joseph ever become a ruler, and why would his brothers bow down to him? Because the whole idea was just completely preposterous in their mind. And when Joseph reported the second dream, even his father became upset and rebuked him. Yet, at the same time, he pondered the dreams. Jacob pondered them because he had received messages from God in dreams in the past. So maybe it was the Lord who was speaking to Joseph. But there's more to it than this. The fancy coat of a ruler given to Joseph was a hint at some point he was going to receive the birthright from his father, and thus the idea that the brothers were going to bow to Joseph, despite their scorn, had now slipped into the realm of possibility. It could happen. And this is why that no one passed the incident off as the ramblings of a dreamer. Okay? They are thinking maybe Joseph was rising to supremacy. He see it happening. The coat was a sign of it. And his family interpreted it as Joseph rubbing their faces in it. Okay? And this is going to set the stage for what's about to happen. Now again, was Joseph being a big-mouth brat? And to a point, I believe the answer is yes. As Joseph could have been a lot more diplomatic in the way he reported his dreams. Likely, the most wisest course was to share them with his father first before blurting it out in front of everybody else. Okay? But on the other hand, one can make the argument that he was right in sharing them with the family because it was a vision from God, and therefore it showed what the will of God was going to be. And despite being the favorite, Joseph was definitely not ready for any leadership role that he was being groomed for, even within his own family. That's the whole point of the jacket and everything. The dreams were indeed prophecies from God, but it was clear Joseph was not ready for them to be fulfilled. And Jacob, in his tinkering with the family dynamic, would have the exact opposite effect. And as we are going to see, it's just making things worse. Now, though Jacob had pondered the meaning of the dreams, he had not grasped the significance of them, because had he done so, he might have had the faith to avoid a tremendous amount of heartache in view of what is now about to happen. But what we see, Joseph needed molding by the Lord, and now that process was about to begin. Verse 12. Then his brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." So he said to him, "Here I am." Then he said to him, "Please go and see if it is well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me." So he sent him out of the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. Okay, let's stop there for a moment. We need to think about this for a second. A lot of questions crop up, and most of them can be pretty easily answered. First of all, Why were Jacob's sons pasturing their flocks 50 miles from home when surely there was good grassland available closer to Hebron? Well, let's take a look at it. We're not really sure how large the flocks of Jacob were. We knew he had a lot, okay? And it was possible that they did not want to overgraze the grassland closer to home. For one other reason, Grandpa Isaac, he's still alive, and he had a large flock of animals of his own as well. And one of the duties of a shepherd is to preserve one's grazing area. This was extremely important, especially with large flocks. And here's why. A lot of people don't know this, but when sheep graze, they have a tendency to pull the whole grass plant out by the roots and eating the roots as well. And this essentially kills the plant. And this is opposed to cattle, which merely eat off the blades of grass but leave the plant intact so it can grow back later. Okay, sheep don't do that. Once sheep go through, it's pretty much desolate until more seeds are planted. So yeah, you're going to be here for a while, but there's a point you have to stop because otherwise you'll have nothing. And we're also not told the time of year this all took place. If there has not been a lot of rain, which is typical of summers in Canaan, they were more inclined to find places that had plenty of available water. And again, with Isaac's flocks to tend to, splitting up was actually a wise move. Okay? Now, this brings up another question. Okay, that makes sense. I can gather that. That seems logical. But why did they return to the dangerous area near Shechem when Jacob's family had such a bad reputation among the inhabitants? After all, in vengeance for the rape of their sister, they went into the town and killed every single man and took all the women and children and made them slaves and brought them away. And of course, whatever flocks these guys in Shechem had, they took them as well. Okay? Now, granted, perhaps the brothers didn't want anybody from the family spying on them. Maybe they were involved with some shenanigans with the people of the land, and they didn't want their father to find out about it. But they probably felt safe because it was unlikely that the city had anyone left living there. They'd taken everybody out of there or killed who was left. And also, they were on their own stomping grounds. They had lived there for a while. They knew the area. They knew where it was safe. And considering how many sheep they had, we hear about the 10 brothers, but also they had a lot of servants, and this would be a large enough group of people would discourage any would-be attackers if anybody was seeking vengeance. But then there's the biggest question of all. Knowing that his sons hated Joseph, why did Jacob send him out to visit them alone so far from home, wearing that special garment that had aggravated everybody so much? Okay? Such an action would scream to the brothers, "Here comes the boss!" And thus their welcome would not be cordial. Quite the opposite. I can imagine them thinking, if that little twerp thinks he's in charge, we'll just take care of that problem right here and now. Which is indeed what they were thinking. Honestly, this was not a wise move on Jacob's part. He could have sent out one of his trusted servants to do the job just as efficiently. In fact, we're about to read that Joseph actually got lost and had to ask for directions because his sheltered upbringing did not prepare him adequately for going out into the big world. And this was not just a short journey down the block to the post office or the grocery store. 50 miles would take a man on foot about 3 to 4 days. And thus he had to be prepared for the journey, carrying food for the round trip, some water because there were springs and wells, so he didn't have to take the whole thing of water. And he probably had a walking stick with him. And even if you take, let's just pull the threat from the brothers out of the picture. Even if you remove that, it was still a hazardous walk for just one person. It was never wise to travel alone in that area for long distances. You had the potential for wild animal attacks. That whole area, they were filled with bears and lions at that time. And there were other predators that could cause a lot of grief to a person who was walking by themselves and unable to defend themselves the stick's not going to do it, especially if you're not a strong shepherd, because clearly Joseph was not. You also had attacks from bandits and marauders. This became a distinct possibility because that coat that Joseph was wearing would mark him as a potentially rich and tempting target. Okay? And it's not like Jacob couldn't spare any servants. Okay? And Joseph should have been sent out with at least one. But I have to remember, Jacob made that same trip alone years before, and he knew that God was taking care of him and protecting him, so perhaps he felt that those same protections were applied to his favorite son as well. There's a flaw with this kind of thinking. God's not going to protect a person who foolishly goes into danger with the assumption that God will take care of me no matter what I do. And that's kind of what happened here. And we see this. This happened during the temptation. Jesus was taken to the top of the temple. Satan was there and says, look, the Bible says this, you're not going to bruise your foot. God will protect you. So let's prove the point. Show that if you are the Son of God, just throw yourself from here and let the angels keep you from falling. And Jesus' response was, no, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. What this tells us is such protection was contingent on being within his will, not to be taken for granted when not in his will. Just to throw myself off just to see what's going to happen, that's tempting God. It's not going to happen. And so Jacob did the same thing. Oh, God's protecting me. He'll protect Joseph. And ultimately, no, that's a bad assumption. The answer, though, let's be honest, was God was behind the whole thing. He was working to accomplish his defined purposes for Jacob and his family, and ultimately for the whole world. God had ordained that Joseph would go to Egypt. Now, this was a prophecy actually given to Abraham. His descendants would end up in Egypt for a certain period of time, and this was the way God accomplished that. Okay? So, let's continue on. In the meantime, we find Joseph wandering aimlessly about, verse 15. Now a certain man found him, and there he was, wandering in the field. And the man asked him, saying, what are you seeking? So he said, I am seeking my brothers. Please tell me where they are feeding their flocks. And the man said, oh, they have departed from here, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. Now, when they saw him afar off, even before he came to them, they conspired against him to kill him. Then they said to one another, look, this dreamer is coming. Come, therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit, and we will say some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams. But Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands, and said, let us not kill him. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, but cast him into this pit, which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father. So it came to pass when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him. Then they took him and cast him into a pit. And the pit was empty, there was no water in it. So after making the journey from Hebron to Shechem, his brothers were nowhere to be found. And Joseph clearly had not learned enough about shepherding to look for traces of the flock's path to show where they had gone. Sorry, sheep are not stealthy animals. They leave a trail. And it's easy to follow that trail if you know what you're looking for. So, a stranger comes along and asks him, what are you looking for? And Joseph says, well, I'm looking for my brothers. And the brothers, it says, oh yeah, no, they've moved some 13 miles north here to Dothan, and that would be another day's journey for Joseph. And so when he comes within their range of vision, and I gather based on here that I guess this coat kind of made him dress like a neon sign, because they looked and it's like, oh, there he is. And far away, it's like, okay. And apparently, naively, Joseph wasn't expecting any trouble. He figured, okay, yeah, it's just the brothers. Everything will be fine. But they spotted him, and they began to make their plans. And this is a good example of how hatred and envy combined can be so lethal because it simmers in the heart and waits for a spark that was going to set off an explosion. And it's clear the brothers didn't have to be tempted in order to decide to harm Joseph. All they needed was the opportunity, and now it was within their grasp. Cool, we got him. Their statement, "Here comes that dreamer," implied they felt that all of his fine dreams had come to nothing. It was a sarcastic statement. Now, Bible doesn't tell us which brother suggested they kill him. Some scholars believe it was Simeon, simply because, well, he did have murderous tendencies. He was the one that led the raid on Shechem to kill all the men that were there. And he might have been the ringleader based on, well, we're going to see later in chapter 42 that Joseph in disguise treated him much more harshly than he treated the rest. But we do know Reuben did not make that suggestion. This is interesting because of all people, it was his counsel that they throw Joseph into a dry cistern or a pit. And this, considering what he had done in the past, it was a surprising show of character. And all the more surprising because he had the most to lose if Joseph received the birthright. And so what happened? He said, no, don't kill him. He had a sense of right or wrong. He's our brother. You don't kill him. But he pretended to go along. He said, no, just put him into this cistern here. Now, they call it a pit, but it's actually a cistern. And these things were built. They're actually dug out or chipped out, carved out, I guess is the best word, in solid rock. And they're usually filled with water during the rainy season as a place to get water during the dry season. And this particular one, it says, was dry. And he's going, but he says, okay, put him in there, we'll let him die. But he was going to go, Reuben himself was going to go back and pull Joseph out and somehow return him to Jacob. And I don't think he had time to think it through because, well, if he had succeeded, how was he going to do this? How was he going to take Joseph back when the other brothers want the guy's blood? And then again, Jacob would then find out the truth of what happened, and his reaction would have created probably more problems in the family, though, as we have seen, he never really took punitive action against any of his sons, no matter how bad they acted. Okay? And let's commend him. Let's give credit where credit's due. Reuben protected Joseph from death. And again, he was the firstborn, and he knew that Joseph was going to replace him. Okay, good man. Now, as for the rest of them, they probably took great pleasure stripping Joseph of his special robe and throwing him into the pit. And I will mention a couple other things. These pits, or these cisterns, they're quite deep, and they kind of resemble wells because they have long, narrow openings, and it would be too sheer or too hard for a prisoner to climb out. Now, wells, they would have permanent water supply in them because due to the water table. And in order to get someone out of a cistern, the prisoner would have to they'd have to throw a rope down. The prisoner tied himself to it, and then they'd help him climb back up. So he's in the pit. His brothers are ready. So far, the plan seems to be working. Everything's fine. We're going to get rid of this guy. And then an opportunity to profit from the situation presented itself. Okay, verse 25. Then they sat down to eat a meal. Then they lifted their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing spices, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brothers listened. Then the Midianite traders passed by, so the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. So in a way, some people have a hard time understanding how men could sit down and calmly eat a meal while their brother is suffering and screaming and begging them to set him free. But their hearts had been so hardened by hatred and poisoned by thoughts of murder, they weren't going to pay attention to the cries of their victim. They didn't care. I'm hungry, let's eat. This is not unheard of, by the way, even today. Okay, I don't know, a few years ago I remember hearing this. There was a case when two men shot a third person outside of a fast food restaurant out in one of the bad parts of the LA area. And after they shot him, he had just ordered some food. They proceeded to eat his food that he had ordered. Yeah, Jeremiah was right in 17:9. The heart of it is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? I mean, they were hardened. So back to Joseph and his brothers, while they were chowing down, they spotted a caravan. It was a merchant caravan. Now the terms Ishmaelite, Midianite, they mean the same thing, so they're used interchangeably. This was something they did. They would gather stuff and then go down to Egypt and trade it and then bring back what they traded up to where they were at. And I would say it's a good chance when they saw the brothers standing there, they changed course to walk over them, saying, maybe we can sell you something. And that gave Judah an idea. Well, instead of killing Joseph, since it was wrong, okay, as if throwing him into a pit wasn't wrong, they could sell their brother as a slave, getting rid of him and making some money at the same time. And this was they figured it was a pretty foolproof plan, because anybody who's taken to Egypt and sold for a slave, they weren't likely coming back because they probably would never win their freedom. So their plot would never be discovered. The only person who would blab is Joseph, and he's going to be out of the way. And they could also possibly say, we have no clue what happened to him. They kind of washed their hands of the whole thing. And no, I don't know what happened to Joseph. Never saw him again. Sorry. And that would solve their problem. But apparently this was not a unanimous decision, because Reuben wasn't there. Let's go on to verse 29. Then Reuben returned to the pit, and indeed Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes. And he returned to his brothers and said, the lad is no more, and where shall I go? So they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, and dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colors and brought it to their father and said, we have found this. Do you know whether or not it is your son's tunic, or know whether this is your son's tunic or not? And he recognized it and said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, for I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Now, we don't know where Reuben had gone, okay? Maybe he was taking care of some problem with the sheep, or maybe it was part of his plan. He kind of went away so they wouldn't suspect that he was going to go back to rescue Joseph. So when he gets to the cistern, he was shocked to find there was no Joseph. Where'd he go? What happened? He hurried back to the camp. Maybe these guys changed their mind and decided to kill him anyway. And his attitude and actions made it clear to his brothers that his sympathies were with Joseph. Okay? He tore his clothes. He was a man in mourning. And you get the impression that he knows what's going to happen when they get home and Joseph's not with them. Jacob's not going to be happy. And that's kind of an understatement. Okay? Proverbs 28:13 tells us, he who covers his sins will not prosper. And this is God's unchanging law. But it's amazing how many people still think they can defy it and escape the consequences. Among Jacob's sons, one sin led to another as the men fabricated the evidence that would deceive their father into thinking that Joseph was dead, killed by some wild animal. Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. Unwilling to confront their father personally, and here's the funny thing, the brothers sent a servant to Jacob to show them the evidence, and then they told him the lie. He told them the lie they had concocted. Oh, we found this. Do you know who it belongs to? This was a brutal way to treat their father. I mean, I wouldn't do that to my own father, but honestly, I think they thought he deserved it. He never took any action when their sister had been raped. They did all the work. He'd been so favorite. He was like, oh, you lost your favorite, tough beans. We don't want to care about it. We don't want to hear about it. Jacob himself, he'd had no trouble identifying the robe, and he would have no way to test if the blood were human or not. You couldn't tell the difference between goat blood and human blood. And being the one who was prone to jumping to conclusions, Jacob accepted the evidence and believed the story, concluded that Joseph was indeed dead. Now, as tragic and treacherous as this deception was, let's be honest, what comes around goes around. Jacob was reaping what he himself had sown. Years before, he had killed a kid goat in order to deceive his own father, and now his own sons were following in his footsteps. So as a result, he went into deep mourning, and 20 years later, we are going to see that he was still grieving over the death of Joseph. Now, his family tried to comfort him, but to no avail, and the Bible doesn't tell us what the reaction of the remaining brothers was, but perhaps they felt that their plan was not going as they intended. But what did they expect? His favorite son was dead, and Jacob was going to carry this to his grave. Now, years later, Jacob would lament still, all these things are against me, when actually all these things were working for him. Again, he didn't see the plan. Jacob didn't see the whole plan. Now, I want to make sure we understand, it didn't mean that God approved or engineered the brothers' hatred or deception. Okay? None of it was what God wanted to do. And yes, they were responsible for what they did. But it just means that our God is so great that he can work out his purposes even when people are trying to do their worst. And Joseph recognized this. Years later, he'd say, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Now we see one last footnote in verse 36. Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, a officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. Okay, now we're at the end of the chapter. Now, God brought Joseph safely to Egypt and saw to it he was sold to one of Potiphar's chief officers, or Pharaoh's chief officers, Now, Potiphar is a title, okay? And he's called the captain of the guard, which suggests he was the head of Pharaoh's personal bodyguard and likely in charge of official executions. This was typical of the Egyptian government at that time. Now, the important thing was not that Joseph was connected with such a powerful man in Egypt. In fact, we're going to find this is going to backfire on Joseph, okay? The important thing was that the Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered. So thus began Joseph's course of study in the school of hard knocks. The first lesson was likely one of humility, okay? Just because Dad treated him like he was God's gift to the family didn't mean that the rest of the family agreed. And as we are going to see, Joseph really was God's gift to the family, but not in the way any of them thought, including Joseph. Okay? God had a plan for Jacob's family, and he was able to use the family dysfunction to move that plan along. And it's just amazing how God works. It's awesome. And really, this whole story should be a great source of encouragement to us in the most difficult circumstances we may find ourselves. God does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth, and no matter what people try to do, God will still get his way. And when man rules, God will overrule. And because of his power and his love for his servants, all things work together for the good of those who follow him. And as we're going to see as we continue the story, this is what happens. Now, not saying it's going to be a walk in the park, okay? It's going to be a lot of trials for Joseph. There's going to be a lot of trials for the family. Things are not going to go well either way, but God's going to say, it doesn't matter. I've got you covered. Well, my life is horrible. Doesn't matter. As long as you're a believer, God's got you covered. Yeah. But you don't understand, Pastor. Trust me, I've seen a lot. I was a school teacher in California for 30 years. I saw a lot of things. If God's on your side, you've got nothing to worry about. And that's the actual faith. Doesn't mean it's fun. Yeah, going through a trial is never fun. James tells us, consider it all joy to go through various trials. It's like, I've yet to consider one with joy that I've gone through. And I've gone through some pretty heavy ones. But I know God's still got my back, and he's got your backs too. Father, we thank you for this time we had together today, and we thank you again for all that you have given to us, but especially your word, showing how even when Joseph's brothers wanted to kill him, you were still faithful to protect him. And no matter what was happening, you had a plan, and you are going to be able to get that plan moving despite what man's doing. And we see that a lot of times your plans take time because all the pieces have to be prepared and all the pieces have to be in place. And we thank you, Father, that you know what you're doing, even if we don't. And Father, we just love you. We just give you all the glory for this, and we praise you because you love us so much. You gave your Son as a sacrifice because of the sins of the world and giving us the opportunity to spend eternity with you despite the fact that we don't deserve it. And many times we never wanted it, but it was still available. The door never closed. Father, again, we just praise you. We give you all the glory and honor and just thank you again for your great power and great love. In Jesus' precious name, amen.